In this interactive video, we're going to talk about a little more of the background of existentialism, and particularly what's wrong with reason. Why and under what circumstances were the existentialists um, attacking reason and what we know as rationality? What could possibly be wrong with reason? And parts of this lecture will be, or interactive video will be pretty technical, and I'm going to move quickly through some parts because I just hope that you get a sense of the historical development of the concept rather than knowing every little detail. That's not what this is designed for. I just hope that this imparts some kind of sense of understanding as to why this group of people known as the existentialists would have a problem with reason philosophically. So we should start with some purported characteristics of reason, right? What's reason like? Well, first, reason purportedly discovers universal truths um, and tries to explain away difference and how everything can kind of fit under a simple set of uniform laws. This is supposed to be one of the powers of reason. When you look out into the world, you're bombarded with sensory data, right? All sorts of sensory data through your ears, through your eyes, your skin. What is it that lends any sort of sense to this manifold of sensory data that you get bombarded with, right? It's reason and categorization and putting things into classes and excluding things from classes. So that's an essential characteristic is of reason, is that it's supposed to make sense of the myriad of things in the world, right? And discover some sort of universal truth or universal truths. Another one is that it's abstract, right? To be universal, the laws of reasons must not depend upon the particulars of every given situation. Right? It doesn't matter whether you're adding apples, peanuts, or corpses for that matter, right? 2 plus 2 is still 4. So, abstraction, right? And being abstract is a characteristic of reason. And it's impersonal. So in the classic scientific model, you're supposed to reason without emotion, right? Like Spock or any sort of AI. You're supposed to remove any possible emotional content from the thing you're thinking about by abstracting them until they cease to be objects of any feeling. And then you are really reasoning, right? You are kind of transcending the particular so that you can get a bird's eye view and not really be affected emotionally by the thing you're considering, but you're attempting to be rational about it and balance. And as I said, transcend the particularities of the situation. So the question is, how did this is the modern notion of reason, and how did it develop? And this is where we're going to take a quick tour through history since the ancient Greeks. And again, I just hope that you get a sense of the development of this concept and not a nitty-gritty understanding. And so hold on to your hats here. So ancient Greece, 9th to 5th century BCE. Traditional and pre-modern societies are thought to have experienced the world as kind of an enchanted garden where nature itself, right, the external world as we would call it, is meaningful and has values packed into it, like moral values packed into it. And that value-laden order determines the proper function and aim for everything within nature in advance. That's also known as teleological, right? Everything has a purpose, everything has its place. There's kind of an organic wholeness to the experience of people who lived in this time. It's generally thought from works that we have of theirs. And so the ancient Greeks tended to assume that there's kind of a built in order of nature or the cosmos that determines what things should be like and also how people ought to live. And there was no real sharp division between what things are like and how they ought to be in people's minds, right? The best term I can come up for is they experienced an organic wholeness. And people found their identity in terms of having a place and a function within small, relatively cohesive communities, right? Again, that sort of organic wholeness. And Plato comes about 428 to 347 BCE, and Plato had a theory known as the forms. And the forms is notoriously difficult to grasp. Plato himself admitted he had a difficult time putting it across in words. So he used allegories like the allegory of the cave and the divided line and the sun analogy and all of these stories to try to explain what he meant by the forms. But essentially, he said everything that exists in the physical or conceptual world is some way dependent upon forms, right? These transcendent forms that exist independently of our world, but they're the models or the essences or archetypes of all quote unquote reality, stuff that we can think about and stuff that we can touch and taste and feel. The forms are eternal, immutable, and perfect. They transcend and are outside of time and space. Right? And everything that we can hear, touch, taste, and smell is just an imperfect physical manifestation of the perfect form of that thing. And we know these things exist, Plato said, not because we can sense them with our vision or our hearing or our taste, but through the exercise of reason. It is reason and pure thought that enables us, like access, to tap into this world of forms. The senses and the concrete world don't give it to you. The senses only give us access to what is concrete and particular in the here and now, he says. So that culminates in what scholars today refer to as Platonic dualism, or dual meaning two, right? Double. So Platonic dualism says that the world is of two different natures, the material and the immaterial. And for Plato, the immaterial realm is more real than the material because it's eternal and universal. It never changes. It's always there. It has no limit. It's permanent. But the material world, including us, it is less real because it's concrete in particular and it's temporary and it's here one minute and it's gone the next. In other words, it generates and it corrupts. And so it is less real than the immaterial realm. And then this is where you start to get these dichotomies, right? Dichotomies such as the spiritual versus the physical, rational souls or minds and irrational animal bodies, and the true world and the real world, or just the world of appearances. So some of you may be familiar with Plato's divided line, and if you're not, it's fine because we're just taking a quick look at it. This is meant to illustrate essentially the forms, right? See, this line right here is the dividing line between the material and the immaterial, right? So from this line down represents the material world, things you can touch, taste, smell, feel. And then this one up here is the immaterial realm, and truths that you can only access through reason and understanding. The material world, you can get there through perception and imagination. So this imagination, don't think of it like that artistic imagination and creativity. Think of it as just like pictures showing up in your head, right? So each way of each mental activity corresponds to something in the world. Again, so down here, it's the visible world or the sensible world. We have access to all this stuff, right? People, trees, paintings, buildings, rivers, etc. The senses give us access to this. No problem. But up here, things like math, science, hypotheses, and the forms themselves, the senses don't give you access to that. You can't know about those things without reason and understanding. In other words, what he's saying is that you can't touch, feel, or taste these things. You have to use certain faculties of mind. So we see this division there, right? Even animals have this stuff, you can imagine Plato saying, right? But we as human beings have this stuff so we can know these truths. Then we'll take a quick look at just the Middle Ages in Europe, right? 5th to 15th century. Um, Again, you started having people understanding themselves as God's creations, the Judeo-Christian God's creations. And they were inclined to see themselves also as having like a pre-given goal in life, a predestined goal in life. And that was the goal of realizing God's plan for them on earth. So we have this kind of return to this a different kind of organic wholeness, if you will, except now we are getting it from a transcendent source, right? Which is God. So it's kind of like the ancients, but a little different, right? And as with the ancient Greeks, the world is familiar and a place where everything is filled with meaning and significance. Why? Because it's part of God's creation. And you too are part of God's creation according to this schema. So again, people found their identity in terms of having a place and function within small, relatively cohesive communities. So it's come full circle on a different level at this point. Then fast forward to what's known as the scientific revolution. It's commonly thought that this is a good date to put on that, right? Around 1543. And Copernicus publishes his De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, or On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. And it's often cited as marking the beginning of the scientific revolution. And the great achievements of the early scientists were made possible by their ability to set aside their belief in the inherent meaningfulness of things in order to look at the world as consisting of a vast aggregate of inherently meaningless entities, right? Now, instead of looking at the world, this is what we think mentally, I don't know how else to put it, but cognitively, this is what enabled the scientific revolution, is a different mode of thinking comes about over time. No one person is responsible for this, but when we're doing history, you kind of got to create markers, right? So the idea is that At some point, we had to move from seeing the world as just, wow, things are exactly as they ought to be because God wants them like that. And they're meaningful because God made them this way. Something had to happen cognitively for people to be able to go, you know what? Those are just things out there obeying laws of cause and effect. And there are patterns, and I can trace the patterns, and I can record the patterns, and I can use my reason, right, to try to figure these patterns out and predict where they are going in the future, which is the essence of scientific thinking, right? So a new style of thinking starts to come about. But notice what's happening is you're transcending the world of meaning, right? And this earthly Eden here, where things are kind of whole, and you're looking at them from, again, a bird's eye view. You're transcending them and using your reason to do it. So, in other words, to see things in this way requires the ability to objectify the world, to look out into the world and see things as objects in a series of cause and effect relations with one another that can be identified by picking up on patterns and recording them and finding repetition of them. So briefly, because it's just fun, some of the stuff that happened during the scientific revolution. This is a handful. Is replacement of the Earth as the center of the universe by heliocentrism, right? So geocentrism had the Earth here. All of a sudden, the sun's in the middle. Can you imagine that happening? Being told this? Of course, not many people had access to this information. Most people couldn't read. Um, Revival of atomism as the main metaphysical theory, which replaced Aristotelian theory. So it's that, which is also funny because the ancient Greeks had this theory of that everything was made up of atoms, but that got brushed aside by Aristotle, who said everything's made up of fire, wind, water, and earth in different mixtures and in different concentrations. So this saw a comeback and this started to be ditched. We had new theories of motion of material bodies, like inertia and gravity from Galileo and Newton. New theories of disease, right? Um, the onset of germ theory and new understandings of how blood circulated, and the printing press to um, disseminate all of this information to people who could read, of course. So those are just a small handful of the breakthroughs that happened during the scientific revolution. A total turnaround of perspective and worldview. Hard to imagine. Rene Descartes kind of put this, is considered kind of the philosopher of the scientific revolution. He was a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist. He's considered the father of modern philosophy by ushering in what's known as the subject-object distinction and mode of experience, right? Um, Seeing human beings as perceiving subjects over and against a world of objects, like a big division. There's the thinking thing, and then there's the stuff out there. It's thought that people didn't, prior to the scientific revolution, did not think of the world this way, did not experience the world this way. Like there's what's in my mind and then there's what's out there. Not as radically as what started to happen around this period, at least. So it's right about now that marks the shift in orientation of philosophy from like questions about the meaning of life and the health of the soul and what and the good, what is the good, what is the good of humankind, how ought we to live, these big philosophical questions. um, we started to move away from that and toward more specialized, abstract, and technical issues far removed from everyday life. We started to take up more, again, transcendental matters based in reason and leave like the everyday world behind a bit. Galileo, excuse me, Descartes advocated the epistemological theory of indirect or representational realism, which was heavily influenced by Galileo in 1623. Galileo says, I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so on reside in consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all of these qualities would be annihilated. This was major when he said this, because prior to this, we thought that the apple had the taste in it, right? And the apple had the odor and color. And he's here saying, you know what? I think that all of this, these are all phenomenal qualities of consciousness, right? If there wasn't any consciousness, there wouldn't be taste, odors, and colors. This was a major shift in philosophy and perspective. So remember when we talked about Platonic dualism? Here we've come back around again, and now this time it's Cartesian dualism. So Cartesian dualism essentially says mind and matter are two basic realities that can exist completely independent of one another. So this is like Plato, but not quite. And mind is logically prior to matter and hence superior to it. So mind is immaterial and matter is obviously material, right? So in other words, the body was simply like a machine, and that what really defined one's existence or true identity was the immaterial mind. Remember the cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And it's the mind that kind of controls the body. And the body is simply a coalescence of flesh, like a mindless golem, that has little to do with defining one's essence outside of purely material or aesthetic considerations. So the body and bodily and earthly experiences are, to say put on the back burner is understating it, right? They are they are demoted even further at this point. And John Donne was a poet around this time, and these are a few lines from his poem called An Anatomy of the World. And it said, the new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost in the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And I just think this is beautiful. It kind of brings in the scientific revolution, Cartesian doubt, heliocentrism, the whole thing in a few lines. Moving on to David Hume and reason. He was a Scottish philosopher, economist, historian, and writer. He was widely known as an empiricist and a limited skeptic regarding reason. And Hume, in many of his works, essentially argued that there's no real self, there's no real God, there's no real cause and effect. We only have knowledge of that which we directly experience, and that's our only source of knowledge. So we watch this. This is like reacting to Descartes, like, oh no, you don't, bro. Descartes like, oh, we can just get rid of the body, and then Hume swinging back like, we need the body, we need experience, it's our only source of knowledge. So this is what I'm trying to give you a sense of, how we've got this pendulum swing regarding the concept of reason and rationality, sort of going back and forth. And Hume points out something about reason here that it actually is very true. He says, look, it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. It's not contrary to reason to chase my total ruin to prevent the least uneasiness of an Indian or person wholly unknown to me. In short, a passion must be accompanied with some false judgment in order to its being unreasonable. And even then, it is not the passion, properly speaking, which is unreasonable, but the judgment. So it's funny because you start to see Hume try to bring it back to earth, so to speak, right? So we've got this tug of war going on throughout history. And now, whew, right? So 1715 to 1789, we've got the period known as the Enlightenment and the rise of the individual. And this period is thought to be a reformation of all aspects of life. So not just science, not just philosophy, but education, justice, religion, politics, economics, literature, art, and more. A total enlightenment, right, based on this concept of reason. And we have the rise of the concept of the individual as distinct from their social world, right? Which is a new way of understanding the relation of self to the community. In this painting, I Wanderer Through a Sea of Fog, I think it's called, it was meant to illustrate that. Like I can't remember who painted this, but he kind of thought that, man, the way it feels to live in this time is sort of like, here I am standing over and against, I am an individual separate from everything, over and against my community, over and against a world. And, it's kind of lonely. Mm. And society is understood as a human created aggregate of essentially distinct individuals without any inbuilt or internal relations among individuals that are determined in advance by nature or God. Big changes happening here. So the individual is seen as caught in a constant struggle against an impersonal and dehumanizing society. That concept begins to arise, and that's best captured by the painting. Okay, now remember what we're doing here is we're taking a grand tour of the concept of reason, a super sketchy and cursory tour, right? So what's been happening to reason over time, right? Because we ultimately want to know, what is the problem? Why are the existentialists rebelling against reason and this trajectory of philosophy? So Immanuel Kant, he read Hume, who awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers, right? He heard Hume using reason itself to attack God, free will, and the soul. And Kant wanted to get things back in order. So he created a rational philosophy that he thought would make room for religious faith in a world increasingly dominated by science and skepticism concerning the knowability of ultimate truths. So he tries to limit the scope of reason, right? He says there's some things that we can know, and there's some things that we ultimately cannot know. And the things that we really can't know, that's where God and free will and the soul dwell, right? We can't know them scientifically. We can only know them other sorts of ways. And this is known as transcendental idealism, which sets forth that space and time are merely formal features of how we perceive objects. They're not things in themselves that exist independently of us, or properties or relations among them. Objects in space and time are said to be appearances, like your coffee cup or your makeup bag or whatever else, right? They're just appearances. And he says we know nothing about the things in themselves of which they are appearances, right? We've got the phenomenal and the noumenal world, he called it. So just as Copernicus demonstrated that the sun is at the center of the solar system to a world that thought the earth was the center of the universe, so Kant demonstrated that empirical or scientific knowledge relies on the innate subjective structure of how we come to know, right? So we're not actually learning things about the world outside of ourselves in a sense, we're learning more about ourselves. Um, and as a result, scientific knowledge does not know the world in itself or as it is, but only as it appears. That is how we construct our knowledge of it through space and time, sensibility and understanding. And like I mentioned, he referred to these realms as the noumenal and the phenomenal. So what are we seeing here again, right? This is even more detailed than I meant to get, so I apologize for that. But then I realized I just can't stop myself. But so we've got Plato with the immaterial realm and the material realm, right? And then we've got Descartes coming along later, separating the world into mind and matter. And now we've got Kant coming along and separating everything into the noumenal and phenomenal. But what is consistent here? They're all slightly different. One is more sophisticated than the other. They're building off the same basic notions of reason and spinning them off. And like I said, becoming increasingly sophisticated, increasingly transcendental, and away from concrete everyday experience is the point of everything we've been going through so far here. Um, this I'm just going to show you really quickly. It's interesting. If you're interested in this, you can look up Kant's a difficult philosopher, but very worthwhile. And for you philosophy majors, you're going to have to know some Kant. But I mean, he breaks down and argues beautifully using reason what our worlds and lives and mentalities are like. Right? This forms of intuition are space and time, and here are the different categories of understanding, right? He's breaking down the phenomenal realm. That is our subjective way of knowing things, capacities of the rational mind, right? And deriving one from the other. It's really quite a feat. But notice, you can just look at this and you can start to say, man, it's interesting because where are all the questions of um, how should I live? Um, what what is truth? Um, what is the good life? This is all very what's known as transcendental, away from everyday existence. And some of you know the categorical imperative, which is Kant's moral rule. And he says a categorical imperative would be one which represented an action as objectively necessary in itself without reference to any other purpose. So here he's even trying to say, you know what, the way that we treat one another and our entire moral universe is essentially a transcendental matter. It's a reflection of our capacity to reason. It's not derived from anything actual here and now and concrete. And that gives way to Hegel, 1770 to 1831. He wants to try to bridge these two worlds of Kant's, the noumenal and the phenomenal, and he attempts this with his what's known as the dialectic, right? And the dialectic is this. Notice how I've been saying, see how this is kind of going back and forth, and we've got Plato's dualism, and then things go back, and then, ooh, here comes Descartes' dualism, it goes back, and then well, Hegel takes stock of all this and says, oh, this is the dialectic, right? All of history is what he said, Geist or ultimate spirit coming to know itself. And it goes back and forth. You've got somebody who's going to, posit this about the world, somebody who's going to challenge it. It's going to set us up on a higher level. Then it happens again and again and again, over and over and over. And really, that is the way that reason itself functions. Hegel said, your own personal reason. And he extended that to ultimate reality, and to say that ultimate reality is reason becoming more and more sophisticated, more and more liberated from the material world, and ultimately, at some point, coming to know itself. Very strange stuff. Interesting as heck. I recommend it. Start small with the videos and stuff. But nonetheless, we're just trying to chase down reason through history. I'm going to move this up a little bit. Hopefully some of that made sense, right? Long story short. Reason's had a long trip. We've just witnessed some stopping points, right? So against this background, this back and forth of reason, and it's becoming more and more and more transcendental and away from everyday concrete human existence. Against this background rises existentialism, best understood as the explicit conceptual manifestation of an existential attitude or the spirit of the quote-unquote present age for each of them at that time, of course. Philosophical realization of a self-consciousness living in a broken world, an ambiguous world, a dislocated world, a world into which we are thrown and condemned, yet abandoned and free, and a world which appears to be indifferent or even absurd. So these are all the rebellions against her. Like, look, if this project, this rational project was meant to liberate us or have better lives or understand one another and ourselves better, it's failed because we're standing apart from ourselves. Things appear broken and weird. And the world and the way it's unfolding is not corresponding to this grand philosophical project. There's something wrong, right? So the existentialists reject the idea that the exercise of reason can be the paradigmatic exercise of our humanity, because for them, life is essentially concrete and subjective. So they are yanking it back from the transcendental world. Come on back down here, philosophy. We got work to do here. We've been up in the clouds, and as genius as some of that was, and as enlightening and enigmatic and thrilling as that is, as far as the historical unfolding of philosophy is concerned, it's time for you to come down here now, because we need you here. And Dostoevsky, who we'll look at in the next interactive video, says the mystery of human existence lies not just in staying alive, but in finding something to live for. And then I want to show you this.
You know this guy, right?
Jackson Pollock.
Jackson Pollock, that's right, the drip painter. Okay, he let his mind go blank and his hand go where it wanted. Not deliberate, not random, someplace in between. They called it automatic art. Let's make this like Star Trek, okay? Engage intellect.
Excuse me?
I'm Kirk, your head's the warp drive. Engage intellect. What if Pollock had reversed the challenge? What if instead of making art without thinking, he said, you know what? I can't paint anything unless I know exactly why I'm doing it. What would have happened?
He never would have made a single mark.
Yes, you see, there's my guy, there's my buddy who thinks before he opens his mouth. He never would have made a single mark. The challenge is not to act automatically. It's to find an action that is not automatic, from painting to breathing to talking to fucking to falling in love.
So, trying to get us back here. Last slide, everybody. So, hopefully, I don't want to tell you how to interpret that scene, but hopefully, you saw, you understand a bit why I might have put that in there. Thank you for hanging out through this. We covered the concept of reason, the historical development of the concept of reason. It's increasingly transcendental character over history, and existentialism as a response.